Thank you. Thank you to all the organizers for having me here. The hospitality, I think, has been outstanding, and it's a credit very much to the Queen's program. The quality of the discussions as well, formal and sidebar, has also been, I think, quite illuminating and refreshing. It's always nice for me to be back in Canada, and Kingston in particular, amongst colleagues, friends, and even General Dave Anderson. I know he's not in the room right now, but I also know how the rumor networks in the military, so I'm sure that we'll get back to him very shortly. I've been requested to look at how Canada fits into the Indo-Pacific region, and I want to do that within my time looking at that, hopefully not only the relevant lessons for Canada, but perhaps for some broader lessons as well. But I think before I do that, I want to look a little bit at this idea of the international order and how it may be changing. And I second very much what Dr. Muller said yesterday about the need for precision. And I think, sadly, we do find ourselves in an era where perhaps, as Michael Desch says, we're in a battle between rigor and relevance. And academics would prefer one, and perhaps policymakers and decision makers would like the other. And it's very difficult in some cases, especially in uncertain times and in new portfolios, new paradigms, to be both relevant and rigorous at the same time. But we'll strive to get some kind of compromise. I think looking at the idea of the liberal international order that we, I think, fleshed out quite well yesterday, one of the aspects of its liberalness or its liberality is the idea that it's hitched not only to domestic liberalism and principles in that sense, but also to a liberal view of history. That things are only going to get better, that we are going to eventually progress from a chaotic state to a more developed state, and it really is the arc of history will bend in one particular way. I think that's often a forgotten element of the liberal international order, and we do well, I think, to recall that and question it, whether that is actually the case or not. And I think when I look at Canada especially, I wonder if we shouldn't be looking at it from more of a constructivist lens than perhaps a neo-realist lens that we spoke exceedingly yesterday, I think, which I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. The international order, however we may characterize it, I think is constantly changing shape. It's not something that is a static mechanism. So when we find it difficult to answer the question, is it changing? Partly because we don't really understand the full dynamics of it. Does it have cyclical change within one form? Or are we actually looking at the beginning of a transformation? And it's very difficult, I think, for us reading the tea leaves as it is right now to actually make those kinds of determinations. But I would say that there are a couple of ways that we characterize the international system as it is. One is that it is going to rupture, that it is about to hit some kind of catastrophic point where it will cease to be in the current form. Whether we talk about that in a sudden way or we talk about it in some transformative way, that it'll no longer be as it is now. And there's a couple of variants of that, I think. One is the kind of post-1945 system would then somehow evaporate and go back to what we may have seen in the 1930s, where we go to a League of Nations irrelevancy international order that essentially ceased to be with the beginning of the Second World War. I think, though, there is a certain amount of privileged perspective there to assume that we would go from something to nothing or from one state to another state. In a similar way, the second way we look at this is to ask ourselves, who will lead this order, whatever it may be, in the next iteration? We'll go from one hegemon to another hegemon, and asking who the next heavyweight fighter would be, I think also privileges a certain perspective in that for most of world history, we haven't lived in a world where there's been one hegemon. There's been a plurality of different kinds of international orders, and they don't always move from Challenger A being replaced by Challenger B. Looking at that perspective, I think, privileges those kinds of outcomes, and it's probably worth looking at the English School of International Relations, the work of Hedley Bull, Adam Watson, Barry Bazan, and Andrew Hurrell, rather than only looking at a structural realist perspective, which does seem to talk about regime change and order change in a very orderly way. So if we look at this from that perspective, it's a rupture or a sudden change or transformation of the system, there's another view of the international order, which is that it's entirely elastic. That when Trump leaves in X amount of years, I'll let you fill in the blanks, so whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, we will snap back to the original position, and we'll go back to the way it was before, and then everything will be fine. That the system is not really under that much stress. We've seen worse. Things are recoverable. The institutions are resilient. This is only a blip. Those kinds of dialogues are another way of looking at what's going on in the international system. And Canada, too, uses this kind of vocabulary in its own foreign policy. The liberal, with a capital L pronunciation, that Canada is back, harkens to this idea of elasticity, that we would go back to some kind of golden age or time before where we had an interregnum of a particular foreign policy that party was not liking too much. And I think the problem is, being an academic, that neither of these two views is entirely accurate. And I think rather than being catastrophic or elastic, it's probably better to look at least in the short to medium term, the international order as being plastic. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about plastic, we think about, I think many things come to mind: cheap disposable consumer goods, credit card debt, pollution arising from those cheap consumer goods entering our food chain, and all of that I think is also in our future, sadly, to even cast more doom and gloom on this. But I think what I mean in a very physical sense is plasticity rather than elasticity means we don't snap back to original position, but some deformations from that stretching will remain. So you may resort back to some changed shape, but it's not going to be without its marks, without these kinds of deformations. And that's the kind of future I think we need to look at, that we may not see a crack, but we're not going to snap back to some kind of halcyon previous condition either. And those deformations may not be linear. They may not even be universal, but we will see changes that are going to be enduring. So we'll have essentially a multi-speed international order or international system where we have some things remaining the same. So I very much think we'll have an international order marked by states, despite the fact that we'll have multinational corporations and non-state actors. We will largely have a system of states moving forward. However, the dynamics, who's who in the zoo, the actors' intentions may well change. So I think it's no use trying to pick a pure model in that sense, and I think the idea of plasticity is useful from that perspective. So with that being said, let me turn my attention to Canada just a little bit here. And one of the things I think that is quite evident from the discussions we've had so far is that Canada has always existed since its existence in the camp of a hegemon or other, either the United Kingdom or the United States. And that has allowed us to have a particularly safe and secure environment within which we know that our bases are covered, essentially, that we're on somebody's list and that we'll be taken care of. We may have duties and responsibilities that go along with that, but it allows us a certain amount of flexibility as well to take initiatives. And if we go back to the basic principles of Canadian foreign policy, adumbrated by Louis Saint-Laurent in the Gray Lectures, the idea that Canadian foreign policy should be based on national unity, should be based on political liberty, should look to the rule of law, human values, and a willingness to accept international responsibilities, they all made sense in the era of, in that sense, transitioning from one hegemon to another, but very much a place in the world that was going to be, to a large extent, safe and secure with lots of options available. And to the extent that we would get influence or glory out of this, it would be, as Saint-Laurent said, we were seen as competent, energetic, and constructive workers, and this has won us the respect and confidence from other countries. And I think that is the kind of halcyon moment in Canadian foreign policy that we would all like to recapture. I think the problem is the world doesn't look like that now, or isn't going to look like that, especially in the Indo-Pacific for Canada. The extent to which you buy into the fact that we may not have a clear hegemon in the future, or whether we'll have a different hegemon in the future, that changes things materially for Canada in a very big way. And even with the United States and its current administration, some of the things that we would get credit for or would be appreciated for in the previous ages are not being seen in that same light. So multilateralism writ large is not something that is generally regarded, whether that's because of a Jacksonian orientation or the individual idiosyncratic approaches of people like John Bolton and others in the administration. Being a multilateral helpful fixer may not necessarily buy us the kinds of credibility that it has in the past. And to the extent that we are useful as a helpful fixer in the multilateral fora, perhaps we see that being instrumentalized by the United States. So we look at the Huawei arrest being one example of that. We may be useful in ways that we find unpalatable. And then I think also we're not used to the idea that there would be linkage or transactional politics. We expect that, you know, one good turn deserves another, and that things like the rule of law are not up for negotiation. So when an ambassador says to our country, meet me halfway on a particular issue that we think is a value issue, we find that somehow, I think, new territory for Canadians. And why do I say that this has anything to do with the Indo-Pacific? But building a little bit on the previous speaker, multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific is not at all the same density or thickness as we heard explored in the North Atlantic, for example. Minister Jay Shankar, for example, has famously wrote in the Telegraph a few years ago that he thought alliances were very 20th century and they had really no value or place in the 21st century. That would be antithetical to the Canadian viewpoint in terms of foreign policy. And yet that in the Indo-Pacific is the reality within which we would have to operate. And it's nothing to do necessarily with the quality of Canada or the quality of any particular country. One only needs to Google the question, why is there no NATO in Asia, to come up with literally scores of academic documents, articles, and books about the particularities of the Indo-Pacific region and why multilateralism rather than bilateral relationships are more important. And in Asia, I think we find ourselves in a situation where all of those kinds of key principles may be more difficult to apply than they have been in the past. So despite the fact, as Kim Nossal has said, we have a North Atlantic anchor in our intellectual toolkit, that's where we see ourselves operating. It's not about necessarily transcribing that or translating that and turning the Indo-Pacific into the North Atlantic to fit our own purposes. It's not going to be that easy. And why do I say that? Well, we don't have the same bona fides in the Indo-Pacific, and by we I mean Canada. We don't have the same bona fides in the Indo-Pacific as we have in the North Atlantic, for example. We have fought and died in Asia, but not to the same degree and not in the same historical salience as we have in Europe. And our presence is just not that strong. And I'm sure General Eyre will speak about his experience in Korea. And this is not in any way to denigrate the work we have done in any of the fields in Asia. But when you look at the scale and scope of what we've accomplished and what we've done, whether it's sending darts to Nepal, to the Philippines, to Pakistan and Sri Lanka, or sending one ship or one plane patrols to do sanctioned patrols, for example, of North Korea, it doesn't stack up to the same kind of bona fides as we may have enjoyed in Europe. So Canada needs to plan for a plastic future, including all those deformations, rather than imagining an elastic future, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And what I'd like to conclude on is to say that all security is ontological security. Discuss. That would be the professorial way of putting that out there. But I think all security is ontological security. And just as Sumit said, it's about self-image. And where we see ourselves as middle powers, as helpful fixers, these are self-ascribed labels. And we have to wonder if that's the way we are actually seen and if the world actually works in those ways. We have to avoid falling into a trap where we stretch those myths that may have existed, and we've heard a lot of them, sadly, I think in yesterday and today, about origin stories, if we wanted to get into the superpower world, where these myths have served us well. They have done a good job in giving us a particularly stable view of how to conduct our foreign and defense policy. But when we're moving into Indo-Pacific, those myths just don't, they don't necessarily work. So we have to certainly take a design approach when we're looking at solutions, but we should not take a design approach to designing a scenario that we think actually exists out there. We can't create our own story and give ourselves permission to act in a particular way. In the sense that story is out of relation with the material circumstances, we can find ourselves very disappointed.